Hey everyone, so I'm here to talk about the fifth season by N.K. Jemisin. This is a fantasy novel that was published in 2015. It is the first novel in the Broken Earth trilogy. It won the Hugo Award, as did the other two novels in the trilogy, and the last novel in the trilogy won the Hugo, the Nebula Award, and the Locus Award, which is remarkable. But N.K. Jemisin, you've probably heard of her if you haven't read her yet. She's one of the foremost voices in contemporary fantasy, and she's also, I believe, the first African-American woman to win the Hugo Award. So a really titan of contemporary fantasy. And I, as you know, if you've watched this channel for any length of time, I don't read that much fantasy. But at one point during the year, Brian over at Bookish, I'll leave a link to his channel, held this book up and said he wanted to read it at some point. And I sort of commented asking him if he wanted to buddy read it, because I've been wanting to get back into sci-fi and fantasy, because I used to read way more sci-fi and fantasy. It was like huge for me as a kid. But now I don't read so much, and yeah, I thought this might be a gateway drug back into it. Yeah, so he was on board for that, so we had a sort of aborted attempt at a buddy read in July, which didn't go so well, but then we jumped back on and finished our buddy read this month, and we both really enjoyed the discussion we had. And I think Brian is also going to post a review video of this novel, so I will leave a link to his channel, and I will also leave a link to his channel because he has a great channel. If you haven't already subscribed, you should go subscribe. But he'll probably do a review video of this book, and I highly recommend you watch that review because it will probably be very good because he does great review videos. So, on to the book itself. So, the fifth season takes place in a world called The Stillness. And The Stillness is kind of an ironic name for the world. So, all the land in this world is a part of one large continent, kind of like Pangea on Earth. And the reason The Stillness is an ironic name is because this continent is ravaged by very unstable and very severe seismic activity. And that seismic activity causes very frequent earthquakes, almost daily earthquakes, and also sometimes can get so bad that what's called a fifth season is triggered. And this is just a period of basically catastrophic climate change, natural disasters, all sorts of bad stuff happens. There are all sorts of different fifth seasons that have happened throughout history and have generally featured different sorts of natural disasters. And these cataclysms, these fifth seasons that happen every 100 or 200 years or so, make it really hard for civilizations to actually survive in this world for any significant length of time, except for this one civilization, which is called the Sanzed Empire. And this empire has managed to survive many seasons. And so this empire has lasted for thousands of years, where most civilizations in this world would die out after only, 100 or 200. And part of how the Sanzed Empire has survived is because it harnesses the powers of these people called origines. And origines are a sort of class of people in this world who are born with special abilities. They are born with an acute sense for the seismic activity. They can sense when an earthquake is coming. They can sense what kind of stones and minerals around. They can exercise power over stones and earth and seismic activity, and sort of manipulate it in certain ways. They can rend the earth apart, they can move stones, they can raise mountains, they can do all sorts of things. And the Sanzed Empire has harnessed the power of these origins to keep them safe, at least to an extent, from the fifth seasons. There's still a lot of destruction during fifth seasons, but the civilization has managed to survive them, by the skin of its teeth, so to speak. And these origins, if they're found when they're young, they're taken to a place called the Fulcrum, which is where they're trained to control these powers, essentially. Because one thing we learn about orogeny, as it's called, what they do, one thing we learn about it is that it is in large part controlled by emotions. So if an origin gets very angry or very sad or distressed, then that could set off their orogeny and cause destruction that they didn't mean to cause. And so they need to exercise a lot of emotional control over themselves in order to control their powers. And so they're taken to the Fulcrum to train. And essentially the Fulcrum is like the sick and twisted version of Hogwarts, because, as we also learn very soon in this novel, origins, who are derogatorily by many people called Rogas, R-O-G-G-A, are feared. They are feared and almost hated. There's a huge stigma against them. Because they can cause great destruction if they can't control their own powers. And even those who do go to the fulcrum and get trained, are still feared and ostracized by many people in society. And this stigma and hatred goes so deep that at the beginning of this novel, basically the first inciting event, so it's not a spoiler, one of the main plot lines of this novel is a woman named Esun, whose husband finds out that their son that they have had together is an origin, and Esun has been keeping this secret from her husband, but her husband finds out and beats their son to death. So that's how deep the stigma against origins go. And so anyway, that is the first story. So the first story, we have three main stories in this novel with three different characters. So we have Nesun, whose husband beats their son to death when he finds out that his son is an origin, and then kidnaps their daughter and runs away with her, and Nesun doesn't know where he's gone with their daughter, and basically she wants to find him and her daughter, and for one thing, get revenge on him for killing her son, and get her daughter back. The second story is a younger woman, about 20, named Cyanite, who was at the fulcrum working as an origin. So these origins actually do jobs for the government, and will clear a harbor of coral reefs or something, or quell a large earthquake or something like that. So they will do jobs to help various communities around the stillness. And Cyanite is assigned to clear some coral reefs that are blocking up the harbor of a city called Alia. And she's also assigned to basically have sex with and bear a child to another origin named Alabaster, who is a higher ranking origin than she is. There are sort of rankings of origins, which is measured mostly by how many rings they have. So Alabaster is a 10-ring origin, so he has a ring on all 10 fingers. She's a 4-ring origin. So he's a very powerful origin, and she's sort of mid-level origin, and she's supposed to breed with him to produce a child, because it's the child of two origins, it will presumably be itself a very powerful origin. Orogeny is genetic to an extent, but not entirely. There are people who just sort of are born as origins out of nowhere, so it's not entirely understood how orogeny works. But anyway, and the third story, we have a very young girl, under the age of 10, who's named Damaya, and she has just found out that she's an origin, and her parents basically don't want her anymore. It's a very sad first chapter of her story where we see that her parents basically just don't love her anymore now that they found out she's an origin. But she's taken away by a guardian named Shafa. And a guardian, capital G, is a person who belongs to this sort of shady order, who are basically a group of people who keep an eye on the origins, because even well-trained origins can sometimes go rogue or lose control of their powers or something, and guardians are supposed to watch over them and make sure that they don't cause harm if that should happen, and even kill them if necessary. And so she's taken away by Shafa, who at first she regards as a sort of kindly father figure, but who she finds out is a bit more sinister, especially after he breaks her hand just to prove a point to her. So the guardians are sort of paternal and maternal figures to the origins, but also can do terrible things to them. So those are the three main stories, and it moves forward from there, and as you can imagine, those three stories do intertwine, and they are intertwined in a way that you could call perhaps genius. But so some of the major themes of this novel, a big theme, as you can probably see already, is how oppressed groups are treated, how people of oppressed groups are often forced to suppress their emotions and put up this sort of facade that they're happy and content, when in reality they see just as well as anyone else that they are being oppressed and that this world is screwed up and that life is just not fair for them. It's about how horrific things are done to people who are not viewed as human. The orogenies are not viewed as human by most people, and you know, as I think I've already made clear, some terrible things are done to them. And it's also about how people who are different in some way, whether it be perhaps someone who was born with leprosy at one point in time, or someone born with autism, or someone of a highly stigmatized identity, what the lengths that they'll go to fit in, to hide their identity, and to try to fit into. And yeah, I mean, this book really is just, it's a big, you know, epic story, but at its heart, I think it's kind of more of a character study with a lot of sort of dressing on it to make you pay attention. And as that, it is brilliant, because the main characters all have to struggle with hiding their emotions and trying to be sort of this stone-faced, emotionless machine, when in reality they are sort of, they wish they could open their heart to love. It's not a perfect novel by any means. The plot is at times driven by some conveniences and some coincidences that you get the sense probably wouldn't happen in real life. The writing can be clunky and melodramatic, and that did take me out of the story sometimes. However, that is somewhat offset by the fact that I think the dialogue on the whole is quite good. The prose is clunky, but the dialogue is generally quite good. And also, N.K. Jemisin makes use of some poetic techniques. There are brief sections of this book that are actually written in verse, and she sort of makes use of the tools of poetry inside of her prose, and that I think was used to very clever effect at times. And I also, on that note, I will leave a link to a video where Tilly of Tilly's Bookshelf talks about that more in depth. It's a really good analysis of the way that N.K. Jemisin uses poetic techniques in this novel. So yeah, I ended up really loving it. I found it incredibly moving, incredibly compelling, and it's the first time in a long time where I have just stayed up extra late to finish a book, because I was just so thoroughly engrossed and had to read to the end. And I cannot wait to read the other books in the series. So anyway, yeah, those are my thoughts on the 5th season. If you have read it, then give me your thoughts. I really would love to hear from other people who have read this book. And I will be sure to give you all my thoughts on the other 2 books in the series. So anyway, that is all. Thank you all for watching, and bye now.